and how to be bilingual. What he really meant was code switching.
Welcome to the next episode of
This week, we're in. Oh my gosh.
All right. Good afternoon and welcome back. Hope your week is going well so far. I know we have the annotated bibliography coming up, and I want to use some time to talk a little bit more about that one and hopefully give you the chance to share any additional questions or support that you might need for this assignment. So last class, we were talking about social media, why it matters, why it's important, and we looked specifically at the chapter 10 article from Crick that gets into examining the immediate aftermath of Black Lives Matter and the ways that this movement was able to engage with social media, using Twitter and other outlets as a way of really helping to get that movement heard and get it out there. So last class, we talked about a lot of different strategies and tactics that this movement used, many of which we see in other examples of social movements that utilize social media. So for today, we're going to be looking at 2 additional examples that each explore the use of social media in some kind of different ways. But as you're reading and paying attention to that, you might take note of similarities that you're noticing as well in terms of what makes for effective communication using social media and the challenges of social mediated communication. We also had that brainstorming document that you all worked through talking about what we see as both the strengths and weaknesses of social media, the way that it can help to connect people online, create speed and circulation of material, but also the way that it can be, it can run the risk of being performative and not genuine, or the sheer quantity of information that we have, some more or less accurate and credible than others, can definitely mean that we have a lot more to wade through. So as you're thinking about how we make good social change communication, we might think about how we're cutting through the thick fog of noise that everybody has who follows social media. So for today, we'll be looking a little bit at the annotated bibliography. We'll be looking at the quick reading. We'll also be looking at an article that I brought in for this class that talks about accessibility in the context of social change. So both of these are looking at different topics, but I think there's some broader takeaways about how social change happens and social change can work effectively. So as a reminder, annotated bibliography is due on Friday. If you'd like to send me a draft or example annotation for feedback, please get that to me as soon as possible, ideally by the end of the day today. And we don't have a Canvas prompt due to that annotated bibliography. Remember, I have an example annotation available on Canvas if you're seeking some additional help. So this is not for attendance, but I do want you to take a little bit of time on your own just to help you as we're gearing up and thinking about this assignment. First of all, if you have remaining questions or things that you'd like to have discussed about this one, you're welcome to share. Second of all, take a bit of an assessment for yourself. Do you feel prepared on relevant sources? Maybe you've already assembled some sources. Last class, I asked you to look up an additional source that you might use. And then lastly, take a moment to take stock in your topic. So have you picked a topic or issue that you feel good about and you feel ready to explore? If you're a little worried that maybe your topic is too broad or isn't defined enough, that's okay, right? For this assignment, it's okay that there's a broader topic or issue that you're looking at. You might hone it down a little bit as we go from this into your writing assignment later in the class. Take a few minutes to think about and take stock in the annotated bibliography. So are there any questions that I can answer about this assignment? Yeah, so about a paragraph is fine. I would say that the example that I have that's kind of a larger paragraph would be on the longer end of that. But I would say, anywhere in the kind of 5 to 7 sentence range is good. If you're capturing the key arguments and ideas from that source, then that'll work well. Yeah.
The two of those kind of come from the textbook, right?
So no. So at most 2 could come from the textbook. So you could pick 5 that are totally outside of the textbook or outside of the articles for this class. If you feel like none of them are relevant, you can choose readings from the class if there are ones that you feel like are a good choice. But no more than 2 should be from things we've discussed in class. How about sources? Are folks feeling good about where to look and where to find sources? I know a lot of you, juniors, seniors, have done that a fair bit. One thing that I would recommend if you're looking for extra sources is to look at what is cited, like a chapter or article that you're interested in, and trace that, right? So for example, the piece that we're looking at that I worked on has some in the literature review sources related to social movements, and there's a piece about like the ego function of rhetoric. Like, so oftentimes you'll find in a relevant article that other relevant articles are being cited too, in a similar manner to looking at Wikipedia and finding relevant sources, right? So I do recommend finding those scholarly sources, articles or book chapters. Should not be things like blog posts or Wikipedia, though it can be a starting point. What about topics? Is there anybody who is still kind of struggling to figure out a topic or issue that they want to focus on at this point? Again, you're not tethered to a topic. but you can definitely choose a topic as a starting point that you find interesting. Okay. Again, I will do my best to answer emails and turn things back around to you if you need additional. Okay, so for today, we are looking at the two chapters, the first being Crick chapter 10 on fan-based social movements, and then the piece on rhetoric of disability activism. And again, both of these, I think, have some elements that are interesting topically. These are engaging issues to look at. But for each of these readings, what I really want you to be thinking about is, what are the broad things that we are learning about communication and social change? How many of you have either read a Harry Potter book or seen a Harry Potter film? So most of you, right? For me, that was my childhood growing up. In fact, I was aging kind of at a very similar track to a lot of the characters as the books were coming out. So, you know, for a lot of people, it is very ubiquitous in media. There's definitely been, of course, criticism and pushback either at the content of media or content and positions of its author, right? But I think for the purposes of this piece, looking at how fans and people who are interested in media use that media, right, or use that fan base as a method of advocacy, speaks to the way that this idea of shared meaning plays a really big role in social change, right? So if we see this visual here on the right, it comes from the Harry Potter Alliance, which is the subject of this article and is a group essentially of people who are fans and enjoy the Harry Potter franchise, but are also essentially using its messages, its imagery, its metaphor as a tool to advocate on social change issues. So it's interesting to see that it's like gone beyond being a fan and advocating as a fan, but instead applying that interest and sort of topical interest to other things, right? So this example here, nobody should be forced to live in the cupboard. So in the Harry Potter books, right, he lives in this cupboard by the stairway, right, with the Dursleys, and he is stuck in there. And it's kind of being used in this case as a metaphor for LGBTQ folks, right? It's saying you shouldn't be living in the cupboard, you shouldn't be forced into the closet. So it's invoking the imagery of Harry Potter to be making a sort of statement or advocacy on something that's very different. This is different than media that explicitly is making a sort of socially oriented argument, right, or trying to make a point. It's not media that's actively saying a message about something necessarily, but it's media that's being interpreted and used in a way that fans and people who enjoy that media are utilizing as part of social change. You might be familiar, if you've taken a class in English and writing, work of Roland Barthes and the famous phrase, death of the author, right? The idea here is that when an author is releasing content out into the world, they no longer have this kind of personal ownership of how that material is interpreted, right? So you could write a book and try to publish that book, and maybe that book is being circulated and talked about in a way that is completely different than what you had intended or tried to convey. But what audiences pick up on and the meaning audiences gain, right, is this idea of death of the author, birth of the reader, that the shared meaning that an audience builds is what has a lot more staying power than what an author is trying or attempting to convey, right? Things can be read very differently depending upon what members of a group are gaining meaning out of. Right, so another example here from the Harry Potter Alliance is we hear about defenders against the dark arts, right? That's a term that's used in the Harry Potter universe to describe individuals who are protecting themselves from the evil forces, from the Death Eaters, right? And this idea is being grafted onto talking about book banning. So an interesting comparison where that same language of defending books and being a defender against the dark arts is being used here to describe a need to continue to allow certain books. So HPA was formed over 15 years ago, and it's drawing from content in that universe, right? According to its website, it says HPA was formed with a simple idea. What if fans use their passion and creativity to make the world a more loving and equitable place? So I wanted to show an example here of some of the work that they do. Kind of
We're
interesting.
dividing into two groups. Deaf eaters and boredom defeated.
Hours before the midnight premiere of the new Harry Potter film, fans met in New York's Columbus Circle to stage a flash mob duel. But for this group, the message goes beyond fantasy.
Harry Potter Alliance uses parallels from Harry Potter to mobilize over 100,000 Harry Potter fans across the world to be heroes in our world. I'm Andrew Slack. I'm the creator, co-founder, and executive director of Harry Potter Alliance. Harry, Hermione, Ron go on their last hurrah. We are lighting candles all over the world. There will be hundreds of parties. We're calling them remote parties. We have sent 5 cargo planes to Haiti. We have raised over 55,000 books across the world. In youth village in Rwanda, we engaged in a competition on Facebook called like Chase Bank Community Giving, and we won $250,000. We're using that money to make sure that we get 1 million people involved in LGBT activism, to expand on our human rights campaigns, and to expand on our literacy campaign. We're going to do 7 issues, which is very unconventional for a nonprofit to do, but we have to be epic. We have to go with the books.
So kind of interesting, right? Again, if you haven't worked with her already, Dr. Tony Anderson in communication has a specialization in kind of fan media, fan culture, fan movements. It's a really cool person to talk to if you're interested in more of that stuff. But I think it's really interesting that the parallels and some of the themes and ideas right from the books are translating into advocacy, and also that it's extending beyond just being a fan of something, but about mobilizing people toward issues or topics. And again, the HPA has actually had significant sort of a very complicated and at times contentious and even adversarial relationship with its author, right? And that difference has very much fueled part of that movement too. That movement has distanced itself from some of the things that have been said or advocated for by itself. So it's interesting to note that disconnect as well. Many of you are probably familiar or have seen, right, the visual of the red dress that has been used a lot, especially in the context of abortion and reproductive health related issues, or issues more broadly impacting women, right? This is, of course, from the book and TV show The Handmaid's Tale, right? The idea being that there is this dystopian, incredibly patriarchal society in which women are forced to wear these red dresses. And in a similar vein, right, the imagery of The Handmaid's Tale is being used as a method of protest and activism, including at the nation's capital. So that's an example of how that kind of imagery is being invoked. Somebody is not necessarily a fan in this case of the Handmaid's Tale franchise. There might be people who are using this imagery who are not associated with or don't consider themselves to be very familiar with Handmaid's Tale, but are using, again, and invoking that imagery to make an argument that if you are sitting there in that red dress, or you're making a claim about the state of the world, especially in that dystopian context. Dystopian literature, of course, gets used a lot in the context of social movements, social change, and social advocacy. In fact, there's a good chance that you have heard a whole lot of people discuss or make references to 1984 by George Orwell, right? That comparison has been used a lot in a lot of different contexts or in a lot of social or political arguments. So a lot of what we can consider to be fan-based social movements, right, got their origins in a lot of communities of women in particular, right, who were not necessarily given the same political and social opportunities for change, but were able to sort of find and begin mobilization due to finding kind of shared understanding and camaraderie in being fans of media, but there was a lot of difficulty early on with travel, with organization, with finding like-minded people, right? A lot of conventions and events were used as a way of group members to come together, but prior to the internet and social media, it's much harder to find fan-based movements that could connect with each other effectively, right? You had like conventions, for example, for Star Trek, right? They've had a lot of big conventions and events, but you couldn't have that same type of mobilization. So online communities really were helping to birth a lot of fan-based social movements because, as we've talked about, let people from anywhere at any time come in and participate. People would participate, in an online forum. People could use social media. People could organize, host, and participate in different events. So there were a lot of different ways that these fan communities could start to develop and connect with each other over time, right? Or even interactivity online that could happen too, through hosting virtual events and other spaces, right? I'm a big Super Smash Bros. Fan. You can now play it online, although Nintendo's online services are a little bit weird. So online communities help us to create context for fan-based social movements. So we saw here, right, Harry Potter Alliance is advocating and talking about a lot of social issues, including aid, support, and other topics. And so the participation in these groups, the membership of these groups, the structure, the organization of these groups is creating the circumstances by which that group can advocate. They're doing that upfront work, right? If you see a number of people in red dresses at the Capitol, well, there is an element of online organization and mobilization that has helped to make that happen. In other words, this idea of fan activism is civic engagement that comes from the fandom itself. You've got a group of people who are really passionate about this thing as a fan, but also passionate about a social or political issue that they want to see discussed with it. So one kind of interesting component, right, are the specific types of images that fan-based social movements choose. So one really interesting comparison that's talked about in this piece is the character in the Harry Potter book and film series of Neville Longbottom. So in the first book, the first movie, right, Neville is this very awkward, shy, not very good student, but by the end, right, he is very heroic and incredibly brave. And this idea is that over the course of this character's journey, going from somebody that is awkward, uncomfortable, maybe a little bit unsure of himself, and occupying this more heroic and fighting role, that this parallels what it's like to be an activist or proponent of social change. That like Neville, right, we can go on this almost hero journey to develop and become a version of ourselves that can really advocate for things that we care about and feel passionate about, right? So the specific imagery, character choices, and so on that are being used by fan-based social movements are really invoking those elements. So fan-based social movement grounds its rhetorical appeals. Again, think back to available means of persuasion, think back to ethos, pathos, and logos, and fan commitments, cultures, and practices. So what does it mean to be a fan of something, right? Knowing different details about that group and its characters, elements of that culture, right? And the things that fans of somebody would do. For example, if you're a fan of Star Trek, you might go in with a little Starfleet uniform or the little Vulcan Eagles. So being a fan provides you with the information that you need to engage with that artifact and be able to persuade people. That image, right, of nobody should have to live in a cupboard, right, would be an example of drawing on our shared knowledge for those of you that are familiar with that universe to make an argument elsewhere. There's also this idea of, that I've mentioned a couple times, of culture jamming. That's a little bit different, but it's the way that a specific argument is being made by juxtaposing or using existing content in kind of odd or provocative ways. How many people have heard of or seen art by Banksy? A couple of you, right? So Banksy is an anonymous artist who does street art and graffiti, and oftentimes will do so in very kind of visually striking and jarring ways. So for example, there's an image of Ronald McDonald holding the hand of a starving child, right? Trying to make a critique of corporate culture. So there's elements there of fan-based social movements playing with established knowledge of movement. And the shared understanding of the fan movement makes it matter. It gives us an impact because we know and understand what that fan movement is trying to say. So the communication happens, right? So this is the thing that I think is really interesting to us because, you know, the social movements that we're exploring in this class are not necessarily outside of this example going to be fan-based, but I think there are some general practices that we can learn and really glean from this article in talking both about social media and talking about the impact that fan-based social movements can have. In other words, right, we can think about the idea of rhetorical work. So when something is trying to persuade us, or when we have to jump through hoops to create this covered under the stairs as a metaphor for the experience of coming out, right? There is some heavy lifting that has to be done for us to make that argument. So the first step is to create what's known as a dominant interpretation of work. In this case, part of the Harry Potter Alliance created a group called Dumbledore's Army, which paralleled this group in the series, right? Which was a group of students and faculty who were tasked and charged with the fight against the evil Death Eaters, right? The fan-based social movements create a sort of ethical framework for these objects. So in other words, right, we view something such as being a part of this army as fighting against authoritarianism or fascism, right? That was the sort of argument that was being made by this movement. And they pair it with civic ethical modalities. Think back to, for instance, people in the red dresses who are using civic engagement, civil disobedience, participating in a protest or a march, right, or another movement as a way of engaging in a civic. Fan work is using symbolism to make the object relevant without directly stating it, right? So, you know, depending on the context of the fan movement, who is the antagonist, right? Who is the villain that should be fought against? Oftentimes, that information is sort of subtle and left unstated, and the audience is kind of left to fill in the gaps for themselves. You know, kind of weird example of this is if you've ever seen the Jordan Peele film Us, right? There is a very odd kind of use of symbolism of people who are holding hands across the world, right? And the usage of symbolism in that film, again, speaks to the way that an argument is being made, oftentimes without this sort of use of direct communication. So what I'd like us to do is to take some time to chat a little bit in groups about some of these questions, right? What I want your group to do is to take some time to find an example of a different social movement that's emerged out of a piece of fan work. Again, it could be shows, movies, games, comics, any other form of media that has generated some type of following or movement that exists beyond just being a fan, but has been about advocating for something. So take some time to do some research into that. What is the movement, and what are the ways this movement is using that fan base to advocate for social? Then I want your group to think about and share what meaning this movement has built from the fan object. In other words, what are the things about this thing that people are a fan of that is connecting to the strategy and choices the movement is making? And then the last thing I want your group to take some time and discuss is what might be some of the challenges of a fan-based social movement, right? What might be some of the limitations that this type of movement has in achieving some of the social change goals that they have. So let's see how many people. So let's do 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's do 1, 2, 3, and 4. Let's do 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, and 3. So take some time to chat in your groups about these questions. You know, I shuffled them around just a little bit. So take some time to chat in your groups about these, and we'll talk about them together in just a little bit.
There's gotta be something. Yeah, I feel like that was such a big one in that whole series. Or like maybe kindergarten.
We've joined one of the groups, like this one over here. We're working on this.
Trying to find like share with these people who like just and it's supposed to be
So you're right. It's just that you bring them yeah. Yeah. And then we do this. If there's a habit of this, based on the knowledge to search for the hashtag, it's knowledge and it's better.
If it's using band work and content as part of the movement, you're welcome to draw some of it.
Pop culture. I think Harry Potter. They really have no shit. So it's supposed to be alliance. What do you think?
The size can be whatever you're noticing, right? Or stands out to your group.
It's not on the wall. But this one, you can turn wall. I would actually want that. Ate like lunch.
So start to think, if your group hasn't already, about some of those challenges about a fan-based social movement. What makes that movement difficult being persuasive?
Me too.
Anybody who'd like some more time here? A little bit more? Okay. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah. No. It's like just a sticker. Yeah, maybe come on. I know. I always forget.
Judging by the lull that we're about ready here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the social movement examples that your groups found, and then what you saw in the meeting, and then what we saw as the challenges of this. So let's start by just having each group share the example of a social movement you found, so that we can kind of understand what's going on there and some of the ways that this movement was communicated. So let's start here with this group. What's the movement that you all found?
We did the Hunger Games.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
we did like the 3-finger salute is like one thing we found was the social movement.
Uh-huh.
And it just means like, there's people that are like, advocating for higher pay, and like, or, yeah, they're advocating for higher pay. And there's other people that like are in poverty and they like kind of go against each other in the movie.
Right.
And that's like kind of happening in like the real world.
Uh-huh.
And so people would post like on Instagram or something and they post a picture of them doing like 3-finger salute and they would comment our Hunger Games. Just trying to like, you know. Odds in our favor. Yeah.
Just trying to see if we can find a visual of this, right? So yeah, so Hunger Games, of course, incredibly popular, another kind of genre of dystopian literature, as you're mentioning. So this sort of reference of solidarity, dystopia, this fighting, right? This again, this kind of metaphor and usage of metaphor to describe a sort of fight or move against what is seen against injustice, like in this way, using this visual symbol from the series to communicate meaning and circulate that meaning through social media, a way that we can really see that starting to develop. The way that messages from media can be used and conveyed outside of that media to make a broader point. It's a good example there. How about here on this side over here?
Our social movement was race bending and based on Avatar: The Last Airbender.
Okay.
So basically, it was to ask more roles from people instead of like, because there was the main role all of the people.
Right.
And it's like a Chinese martial arts kind of show.
Right, because there was that M. Night Shyamalan movie that had that casting controversy. It was like all white, right? So the show and the sort of background of the characters was drawing from like indigenous and other cultures, right? And the portrayal of these characters in the films did not really represent that very well. So we see movements that are in many ways talking about representation in media. There's actually there was a Twitter hashtag campaign that I found to be really kind of interesting. There was a campaign that circulated called hashtag starring John Cho that was talking about Asian American media representation and the fact that Asian American actors were not being cast into lead roles in films. The purpose of it was to take the actor John Cho and put him into covers of popular high-grossing films and use that as a way of visually identifying, hey, we need more Asian Americans in these roles, and this would be great if he was in this role, right? So the kind of highlighting of that representation is done too. So really, a lot of these movements that are highlighting the social issues that go into production, casting, all of that in media can definitely be a way that they're involved as well. How about over here? So we had a group over here on this side.
So for us, our fan social movement was the pop culture fans.
Okay.
They did many like subgroups such as the Villainous Fandom, wherein they band together for social movements to organize and deploy their collective power by sharing knowledge, content, and distributing opportunities to general public.
So rather than so we're not necessarily, we didn't necessarily do pop culture fans, they were the pop culture collaborative.
Okay. Pop culture. Oh, interesting. Okay. So they're doing a sort of broader bucket of people interested in pop culture and fandom and fan culture and things. That's interesting, right? The ability to use that as a starting point. It's definitely interesting here, for sure. Very cool. And then how about in the back here?
Well, so our event was the BTS Army. They have used like a lot of hashtags to promote many different social movements. I think one big Black Lives Matter, they raised over $1 million that was spent to support the movement. That's something that's for more entities.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So it's out of. Yeah. Okay. And it's interesting too because the usage of like fan chants, right, and phrases that are very constitutive and drawing the audience in, right, being used as part of the advocacy has been a common trend as well. So really good example as well of how being a fan of something can kind of become a sort of vehicle or opportunity for advocacy, right, or a starting point for mobilization. Maybe part of it too is that a lot of people who are fans or drawn to something, right, have a similar affinity for whatever it is that that's covering. So let's talk a little bit about some of the challenges, right? So let's go back through the groups and what are some of the things that fan-based social movements might struggle with or deal with as potential issues? So let's start again over here.
Having it be fan based, some people might not take it as seriously because it's from like such a famous movie or person. And then we also said some people might not even have seen that movie, so they don't even know like what it's about.
Any other drawbacks or issues that other groups noticed here?
Like if say like a creator of one of those movies were to like say something or do something against the movement that they're focusing on, could like set back their progress and cause them to potentially lose supporters of their social movement. And with this, what you thought is going to talk about toxic fandoms.
Yeah.
I believe, I didn't really well, but this toxicity or strict from the unprincipled boundaries.
Any, sure.
But like, some may not be as like inclusive as they are. Like if they're inclusive, but then, you don't know, I don't know one thing, but there's a lot of things.
Yeah. Right. So there can be these kind of performative gestures toward inclusivity, but the question becomes inclusivity for who and who is kind of implicated or included, especially if we can consider things like gender, race, and a lot of the ways that a fan community is not necessarily as welcoming to people, right? If there is an encyclopedia about toxic fandoms or toxic fan communities, I feel like the image next to it has to be Star Wars, right? I think these are good examples here of some of the limits and issues that we might see in some of these fan-based social movements, that they have a lot of power because they are drawing from shared meaning and shared artifacts among a group of people, but not everybody is in on it or knows what it's about or what's going on. For instance, even the circulation of a lot of memes that are using and drawing from examples from fan work might be a little bit lost in certain groups. Fracturing, right, and toxicity within communities is definitely a big problem too, right? A lot of fan communities are not fully united in what the message is or what the thing is about. And that can be difficult to create this sense of shared meaning. And again, there might be this disconnect between what the group is hoping to achieve or what its branding itself has and what it's actually advocating for. So I think these are all useful considerations in thinking about how a group has to create this shared language and vocabulary among its group members, and that there are challenges in developing that group's inclusion of members and its ability to advocate for change. So let's take a break and come back at about 2. We'll spend some time on the next article and hopefully get out a little bit earlier today, since I know many of you are gonna get ready and buckle down on finishing that bibliography. So take some time, stretch, grab a drink of water. We'll chat a bit more at 2 about this. That last sip did not go down well. Thanks. So I graduated 2.5 years ago in grad school, but my dissertation has been like sitting in queue for like 2.5 years. And I finally got my published copies, bound copies mailed. So I'm so excited. All right, so let's shift gears and talk about the other article. So this was a piece that I wrote back in grad school, and a lot of my interest was in disability activism. And again, sometimes I feel a little bit weird about putting my work in, but I think it's relevant to this class, and I think it's useful to talk a little bit about areas that I focus on, add to thinking about social media and social movements. And so I think one of the key ideas here is this question of what online and new media activism are able to bring to the table that complicates what we consider to be a social movement, right? Because we hear social movement and there's this idea of movement, right? Of physicality, of moving. And the ability to move is something that not everybody has access to in the same way. So if we think back, right, on the first day of class, I showed this example of Sisyphus and the boulder, right? This idea that oftentimes it feels like you're rolling and moving the boulder uphill, right? That's what social change is about. But oftentimes, just like Sisyphus, we find that the boulder has rolled back down the hill. We've got to start the whole thing over again, right? And that's a challenge that we experience with social movement. There's this feeling of physically moving or pushing for the change. And in this way, when we think about a social movement, if we think all the way back to the Griffin reading, think about civil rights, we think about a lot of contemporary movements, we put a premium on this idea of embodiment, right? Of being physically there and able to participate. Although we talked about the ways that media helps to challenge that and people can engage on that. There is opportunities for genuine participation and activism online. There's also concerns about hashtag activism being performative and not achieving change. So if we think about what movement is, what it means to be involved in a movement, putting us somewhere different is the goal, but how do we do that, right? What does that look like? Well, that can be kind of different. So the use of movement oftentimes can involve danger, peril, and inaccessibility. Again, one example would be trying to go attend a march, but finding that the street has a staircase that you can't go up, doesn't allow surface animals on your street, right? Maybe somebody is having an incredibly bad flare or migraine and is not able to attend. What does it mean for people to be involved and participate and move if the ability to physically move is not always there? Rosemary Garland Compton, who's a prominent disability scholar and activist, once famously said that every one of us will experience disability at some point in our lives, whether it's something that we experience through our entire lives, right? Something that we were born with, or something that we experience intermittently, like getting sick or having a significant injury from sports, right? That would be an example of that experience that we have. So we find ourselves caught in those moments. So what does that mean for our ability to advocate for social change, especially when we think back and we've talked about the idea of body rhetoric, right? Using the physicality of one's body as part of the activism. So one example of a movement, right, and using social media such as Twitter in a way that goes against traditional conceptions of social movement was the hashtag campaign that was explored for this one called #CryptoVote. So CryptoVote came through the Disability Visibility Project run by Alice Wong over here. So the Disability Visibility Project is a website that includes a variety of posts of experiences shared through Alice Wong and other guest editors and other people, a lot of kind of personal experiences with disability. I also want to see if I can access the Twitter page here. So there's a lot here about the disability community in response to some of the recent elections and upcoming elections, right? So there's actually a whole lot of discussion surrounding the Pennsylvania Senate race. If you're not familiar, right, the race is between Mehmet Oz of the Dr. Oz Show, who's a Republican running, John Fetterman, who is the Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania, running as a Democrat, right? Fetterman had a stroke, and so there's been discussion about how following that stroke, media has talked about and covered that race. We're talked about Oz's position and his experience as well. So there is critique here on CryptoVote talking about or using this hashtag in the context of that race, which I find to be really interesting. So it's been used here, but also if you go back much further, the hashtag campaign was initially used as a way of identifying inaccessibility of voting machines in places in the United States. So you might hear the word CRIP and think that sounds like a slur, or that sounds like it's offensive. So the word CRIP is one of those words that has been reclaimed and used by the disability community in a similar manner to the word queer, right? Because word queer had a kind of gender neutral interpretation. It was used in a very derogatory manner toward members of the queer and LGBT community, and that community has largely taken it back, right? And has used that in a more positive way, and we see that term much more predominantly. Similar manner, right? People might identify or use the term CRIP to describe themselves as people with disabilities in a way that is intended to be positive, right? So to CRIP the vote is an action of identifying inaccessibility and supporting a more accessible world, right? In this case, Alice Wong is talking about how there's a unique challenge of Medicaid, right? In a lot of cases with Medicaid and Medicare, once people are married, they lose a lot of their healthcare benefits. And so there's a unique gap there that's being talked about in that context. Okay. So I kind of go through some of the pieces that we talked about on social movement, but a couple other pieces that I think are useful and you might even consider, again, in an annotated bibliography, taking a look at. So we talked about Griffin and Heyman, a lot of these fundamentals of social movements, how to work, how to utilize persuasion. There's a piece that didn't quite make it into this class from Greg. It talks about the ego function of protest. The key argument here is that when you're involved in a movement and you're involved in advocacy, sometimes it's not always about trying to persuade and convince the audience that you're trying to address or trying to move, right? Sometimes a major goal of the movement is to rally, to gather support, and to create a situation in which you yourself feel greater confidence or solidarity or camaraderie with the people that you work with, or you create connections and networks with other people too, right? So this ego function, serving somebody's ego through participation and engagement, right? Not in an egotistical sense, but an ego in the Freud sense of supporting your identity and identity development as being a part of a group. And then Michael Calvin McGee was a communication scholar who talked about this idea, essentially complicating the idea of what a social movement even is. His argument was that a social movement is not what Griffin says, where it's a beginning, middle, end, and has this easy chronology, but rather that understanding a movement is something that we do, right? There are things that happen, there's communication that happens, there are fragments that happen, and if we put those things together, right, we pick up the pieces. It's kind of like trying to reassemble a mirror with broken glass shards, right? We're putting it all together to try to create a picture to better study and understand the movement that's happening. So in a lot of cases, right, studying movements that have been originated and happened online, like Twitter, it's hard because there's a lot of different components and elements of these movements to try to study and try to make sense of. My brain wandered for a minute because in looking at Twitter and the ways that Twitter has been talking about that Senate race, I figured that is probably going to be a new paper. So see where that goes. So people who have taken health and science with me know a little bit about disability. So I'm going to recap some of this, but the two models of disability, I don't know are talked about a whole lot. I think disability studies more generally is an area that there's not a lot of attention dedicated to. So what we have moved between is the medical and social model. How many people have heard of these two models before? Okay, a couple of you, right? So the medical model of disability is the idea that a disability is a problem, right? It is a thing that a person has that means that that person is less than, is dealing with an issue, right? And there are contexts in which that approach is helpful. If somebody has an injury or somebody has a specific illness, right? Identifying and diagnosing the problem can be helpful. The issue, though, is that there are circumstances where an individual problem is not what needs to be focused on, but rather the idea of the social attitudes, the structures, and elements of society that are disabling, right? Really good example of this is curb cutting or access to ramps, right? When you go to a curb at a city intersection, is there a slope or way that somebody in a wheelchair can get onto that curb, right? That's an issue of accessibility. Society has created that curb and that barrier that makes it more difficult for those with disabilities to participate. One example here on the right was what was known as the Capitol Crawl, where folks with disabilities were crawling up the steps of Capitol Hill, right? And doing so as a way of visually highlighting broader issues of accessibility and participation, right? Disability is something that's oftentimes seen in a very derogatory or negative light, and visually displaying and showing an accessibility was part of the body rhetoric and communication strategy used here. Wanted to share just a short clip going over some of the elements of the social versus medical model.
According to the medical model of disability, the word disabled means less able. Less able to achieve your potential, less able to have meaningful relationships, less able to play an active part in the world around you, and that this is just your bad luck. This outdated view of the world puts the responsibility of overcoming disabling barriers on the person with an impairment. But this idea is changing. The more modern social model of disability says that the person doesn't have a disability, that they are disabled. They are disabled by society. It is the attitudes and physical barriers imposed on them by society that prevents them from achieving their potential. The social model was developed by disabled people and their allies.
So again, we'll talk about this in a minute, but this idea of polling stations is something that connects pretty closely here, right? Again, medical model says you have a problem, there's something wrong with you. Social model says there's something we need to do better, right? And we as a society can make this a bit more accessible. So I think this is useful to understand the context of disability activism, right? Because for folks with disabilities or folks who are disabled, that being disabled is an identity category that emerges from unequal power structures and marginalization happens as a result of that, right? I think it's also important to note the sort of usage of language here. So some people prefer disabled person, right? So particularly members of the deaf community who also may or may not consider themselves disabled. Members of neurodivergent communities will oftentimes very adamantly use identity first language, saying I am a disabled person. Other people feel strongly about the use of person first language, which has been used more commonly in the past. I'm a person with disabilities. The sort of general advice that I give is everybody's got a different preference. and respecting how somebody wants to refer to themselves, recognizing that there are differences between those two, I think is probably the best way we can be sensitive to the needs of different people. So another element here, right, is this idea of hashtag activism that we have talked about a little bit in this class, that using outlets such as Twitter can help us to generate new meaning. It can create these virtual spaces for activism, awareness, and information that are otherwise available, but that the use of online media does have its limits. I think one thing that a few folks in the class like Kiana have brought up, right, is this idea that accessibility can be facilitated online in a way that might not otherwise be available. So when we consider the benefits to social media and online activism, I think that's one of the big ones, is that if we assume that otherwise people will be there face to face, they can't always be there. And there are a lot of other barriers, such as financial barriers, right? You can't necessarily fly out across the country to go to a demonstration. So in this project, right, the goal was to look at the CryptoVote hashtag. And in particular, I examined and kind of analyzed and coded the usage of the CryptoVote hashtag in the week leading up to the 2016 presidential election, because that was a time in which that campaign was really gaining its popularity and attention and being used in order to discuss issues of inaccessibility in voting. So some of the main things that emerged here were the ways that this campaign was providing accommodation information. So one thing that this campaign did that was especially unique was that it was essentially going to polling places, and folks with disabilities would attend those spaces and report on the accessibility that was or was not present at those spaces. So the Voting Rights Act says that polling places and stations in the United States need to be accessible, but the reality of that is that many of them are not up to code or compliance with a lot of regulations that prevent people from voting. And of course, we've seen major changes in the most recent elections as to how voting has happened, right? Increase of voter by mail and absentee voting in the context of 2020, and a lot of states that are doing that going into 2022. Oregon, of course, is a vote by mail state. And so that's just something that we have done in the state for a longer period of time. But looking at, especially in the context of other states where polling places exist, I think it's important to highlight some of the issues of inaccessibility.
Why is voting so inaccessible to people with disabilities? What if you've done everything you could to vote? You registered on time, you researched your candidates, you requested your ballot, and yet you still can't vote.
This time I had trouble voting because there's only one meal person from me.
I have voted in places before where the accessible door was locked, where there were steps to the entrance, or where the accessible voting machines were broken.
You makes you feel like you don't have to.
Welcome to the
So a couple snippets here highlighting people expressing inaccessibility. That inaccessibility was also being shared using hashtag CryptoVote. People would post photos of broken polling machines that were like the only accessible ones, and providing information about that broader issue of accessibility. There was also, in terms of candidates and policy, a lot of discussion too about how candidates were positioned on disability issues, whether it was presidential race, state legislatures, and ballot initiatives, right? Becoming aware of the issues, what was at stake, who's involved in those issues and topics. That was another effort that CryptoVote did to try to provide education and awareness on some of those issues. And there was also this idea of voter pride. A lot of people who use the hashtag CryptoVote to identify that they went to the polls, they went to go vote. Maybe they had accessibility issues, but they found a way to do it, and they are happy that they were able to vote and express themselves in that civic way, right? So essentially, this campaign was able to speak to some of the elements of accessibility, but also able to show us elements of how online participation can facilitate that. So what I want us to consider here in your groups for our last activity of the day is to think about, as we've been talking about, these online spaces. So within an online space or group, what can be done to make communication and activism more accessible within that space? So we've been talking a lot about how Online spaces can create accessibility that might not be there face to face, but what can be done to make an online space more accessible? So return to your groups, take some time to think about that, and we'll talk about this together.
Make that more.
Take a couple more minutes. Sounds like groups are about done here. Okay, so I want us to go between the groups, and as we're going between groups, why don't you share some of the things that your group talked about in order to make online spaces a bit more accessible? So let's start over here on the side.
We did a couple things.
Uh-huh.
We definitely thought about like opportunities, more like social media, on my.
Uh-huh.
And then something we could do is just have like easier settings in terms of having things like panels. And then have access on different devices, because I know like Snapchat just recently updated it where you can even on Snapchat, I believe. And then, or if they have like the interpreter option in the bottom corner. But all in all, in general, if they just have like an overall video or article on the different accessibility settings that you could turn on so people are informed of those things.
Yeah. I like your point here about not only having those accessibility settings, but also in ensuring that people are aware of those and how they can access them. For sure. But here in the back.
So we were talking a lot about like using voice memos more often. So the issues with like tone, understanding which tone you are, and also like, people who struggle with typing, whether it be because they're older or they struggle with sight and stuff. And also just like more, I feel like we felt like there should be more advertising about the need for accessibility. And that could be like using these influencers or different types of and reaching international.
Right. So not only advertising about accessibility features that exist, but also advertising to make or push for those things to exist, right? Because just not having those features available can be a really big problem, and we could even have social movement activism forming out of trying to incorporate those accessibility features, for sure. Here in this group.
We kind of have like similar answers, but what another one we had was some like streaming videos have people in the corner doing like sign language, and maybe like we need to have more of that because there's some like videos that don't have access to that.
Yeah.
So people are
Yeah. So I think I've mentioned that my partner ran a disability rights nonprofit for several years, and one thing that she started to do in their board meetings was to start having ASL interpreters at those meetings, even though none of the folks that were in attendance at those meetings themselves needed interpreters. And the idea was that all of the meetings were going to be recorded and publicly available afterwards. So what if people wanted to see previous meetings and see those recordings later? So using things like interpreters to help in making sure those meetings are accessible. Oftentimes you'll have like an ASL interpreter in the corner. Sometimes there'll be like a kin there if it's something like a Zoom meeting. All of that can be incredibly helpful to ensure that all of that material can be accurate. And here in the set.
We kind of said like most of the same stuff, just about how like closed captions have been more popular on like TikTok and stuff.
Yeah.
And also on this article that I was reading, it says that recently there have been like online versions of popular marches for people who can't physically attend.
Yeah. So yes, so I actually wrote another piece about the disability march, which was part of the 2016 March on Washington, and it was a number of folks who attended virtually and shared little narratives about their experiences with disability and were able to attend remotely. So there's definitely been like specific marches and spaces or things like vigils, right, that are being done in an online capacity. Used to be, closed captioning, and those opportunities can be really important too, so people can follow along. Another thing that I have not been perfect at doing, but I know can be really helpful as well, is the use of alt text. right? And alt text for images, allowing people who cannot see the image to be given the keyword or description that covers what that image is, so they can understand what the image is covering. You know, there's some elements there. And I mean, I think it should be pretty obvious why we should care, right? But we should care not only because we want things to be more accessible and available, but, you know, a lot of you mentioned that what you're hoping to get out of this class is a chance to better communicate on social change, communicate about issues that you see as important and want to push for. And I think the way to do that is to ensure that how that information is being provided or shared or how you're advocating is done so in an inclusive way, right? Who has access to the things that your group or your organization or your advocacy is trying to reach. And I think helping to bridge those gaps brings people into the fold in a way that we might not otherwise see. Really good observations here about some of the ways to help to promote accessibility in some of these spaces. So we spent a lot of time this week talking about online social movements and online activism, what makes the elements of media and activism online work, and what areas we can see these things continuing to be in need of focus and change. I think the key idea here is it's always changing, right? That the platforms and ways that people are communicating online are going to be way different 5 years from now, and being a part of and I think attuned to what those changes look like is important. Some of my older colleagues in communication do the almost like millennial or Gen Z thing or Gen X thing where they make their personality based on not knowing what TikTok is. And to some extent, I'm like, well, we do communication, right? The point is that we are trying to adapt to and understand to all the ways that these things change, including these new apps and tiers. So we're in this constantly evolving process with media that we engage with online. So continue to think about that in ways that you see social change communication engaging with that, because it's a reality that we have to do some online presence or component as a part of just about any method of change and can generate that change. So for next Monday, we'll be talking about space and place. So we'll be moving on a bit more to the physical and the embodied, and how the usage of locality and invocation of place is able to help support and make arguments. So please either pass forward or email me your group's work for today with your group members' names on it. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Best of luck with your annotated bibliography. Send me along any help that you might need. I'll also be in my office tomorrow morning or Friday morning, and have a great weekend.